Nii, tere hommikust, head kogunenud. Soovin teile kõike õnne, et olete siia konverentsi päevale täna kogunenud. Ma lülitun küll kohe ümber inglise keelele, aga ütlen enne seda, et eriti hea meel on kõigi nende Eesti osalejate üle, kes said täna siia või teisele poole ekraani tulla, et osa saada mis meie muuseumi jaoks on üks suur muuseuminädal, et siin on ka moment selle kogukonna kogunemise jaoks, sest kõik teist ei saa olema nädala teisel poolel. But now I will switch to English to essentially say the same, that I welcome you here at this event, both on-site and online. There are many participants online, so it is a hybrid event, but I'm personally very glad to have it here after 2 years, because 2 years ago we were about to organize a large 60th anniversary conference called Relevance, which of course for the known reasons was not able to happen. So I thought today that what we have here is kind of a short list of speakers, but at the same time it is of course a completely new event. But my pleasure today is actually not to speak here, but to give floor to others, because this short list is really a list of great speakers in the museum field. And firstly, I will give the floor to the director of the Estonian National Museum, Kertu Saks. So please have a floor here.
Head kolleegid, dear colleagues, tere hommikust. Good morning. It is my pleasure to welcome you at the 60th annual conference of the Estonian National Museum. These are extremely weird and difficult times, and there rise so many parallels with the times all of us know and remember too well, the times of the Soviet occupation. The heading of this conference is Relevance, and the core idea of this concept has proven to be very accurate in the context that we all live in right now, the context of war. The work that the museums do every day, the knowledge that we offer, is extremely relevant today. What we have witnessed here at ERM, as we call our museum in Estonian, is that our visitor numbers are growing after the break of the Ukrainian war. As our main exhibitions deal with similar times, and the exhibits actually tell tales of how we came past of these times and how we survived, it seems that people come here for these answers. I believe that today and during the rest of the week, when we welcome here many colleagues for the European Museum of the Year Award Conference and ceremony, a lot will be said about the sense of well-being that modern museums can offer to the viewers in different aspects of their work. We see today that important part of that well-being is also offering solace, comfort, and peace, with the knowledge of being able to come through very different, monstrous times. I would like to thank all the organizers of the conference. Thank you, dear museum colleagues, Agnes, Pille. And I would like to thank all the presenters in advance. Thank you all for being with us today. I wish you a fruitful conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Kertu, for the greetings. And now let's turn to the speakers. And I'm sincerely glad that as the first speaker and our keynote here today, we have someone who has personally praised our museum without being here, and that she's finally here and actually telling us what makes the museums great. And our keynote speaker is Jette Sandahl. So she means or needs no explanation or introduction in a way, but I will still shortly sum up the moments from our webpage about your background. So Jette Sandahl is the chair of the European Museum Forum's Board of Trustees currently, but she has a wide experience in developing and running different museums. To mention some of the pioneering new museums, Women's Museum of Denmark and the Museum of World Cultures in Sweden, in Göteborg. But she's also known to work on the other side of the world, because museums form a common structure everywhere. So she was also a director of experience at the National Museum of New Zealand, Te Papa. And most recently, she was the director of the Museum of Copenhagen, Denmark. But I believe that I'm sincere saying that we never know the administrational decisions the great leaders may make in other institutions. But we know Jette Sandahl for her courage and insights into the museums, like what really matters right now here, what can the museums give to the society and what they have to give to the society and people. So the title of her speak today is No Time for Denial, which you will speak, which we will tell yourself, but I find myself reading it several times this morning and agreeing with this short phrase. So please, Jette, thank you once more for coming here before the main event for you and making this, sharing this week with us at the Estonian National Museum. And the floor is yours for your keynote. Thanks.
Thank you. So here we are, 2 years later, 2 years after this conference was first announced, 2 years into a pandemic, 2 years after Brexit, and 2 months into another intra-European war, which may actually be less about Europe than it looks. And I'm a bit rusty, and we haven't done much of these big gatherings and not much of public speaking in real life. So I'm, arming myself with water and, whatever else it takes. I kept my original abstracts, partly because I was busy, but partly also, and this title, as you said, because I'm not sure of how many of my very current reflections I'm ready to bring into the public context. So I'm staying, slightly in these last 2 years. These past 2 years of the COVID-19 period seem to pointedly epitomize the obligations and challenges for museums in the 21st century, and also to expose some of the fault lines in our relationship to our societies and communities. These are times that call for long overdue societal contextualization of museums, and any thoughts on the relevance of museums call for both a personal and an institutional self-reflection for those of us who are or have been in positions of institutional power in museums. Museums vary, as do their social, cultural, political, and economical context and the expectations held towards them. And their positions, their relevance, or their future obligations are not given, predestined, or preordained. Museums are, to a large extent anyway, what we make them. Museums are not passive mirrors for their societies. They are part of these societies and are also active agents in the shaping of these societies. They're not homogeneous. They reflect the contradictions, tensions, and conflicts of their societies. But in shaping these positions, shaping our current and future relevance, we need to let go of our sort of ingrained 20th century optimism or belief in progress. We need to stop believing that things progressively get better with time. We need a much more precise analysis of the opposing forces of history, also within our own sector, accessing the forces that drive new democratizing development and initiatives, and on the other hand, realizing the strength and the determination of the conservative forces that thwart, resist, and block these. We need to stop forgetting the empowering and liberating initiatives for several decades ago, and we have to stop believing that we are inventing all this right now. The amnesia in our sector, this deletion of radical innovation from our memory and history, is for me part of this larger conflict of opposing forces. But across vastly different backgrounds and conditions, there seems to be a new, broader commitment in museums to engage with current urgent issues and to understanding core museum functions and the museum's social responsibility as an interconnected whole. Increasingly, museums try to address and fulfill their societal purpose exactly through, and not in contradiction or in opposition to, but exactly through the unique, characteristic, and specific museum functions and methods of collecting, preserving, documenting, researching, exhibiting, and communicating the collections and other evidence of cultural heritage. Museums strive to overcome historic and social blind spots and to address current subject matter themes and content. But this also implies, and increasingly, I think this is as important and actually more difficult, it implies a commitment to transcending methodological hierarchies and working from different epistemological baselines embedded closely and actively in the museum communities. Looking around us in our near environment and at the global whole, we obviously need to set about creating alternative futures for our planet, futures that break the projections and long trajectories of current development. I think we need to do this with an equal amount of, on the one hand, optimism and hope, and on the other, an equally determined skepticism, distress, and anger, based in as critical an analysis as we can muster, including a willingness to also critically appraise our own sector and its complicity with power and its support of the status quo. The 21st century requires a different mindset of museums. We will have to be prepared to deal with differences and different points of view, with contradictions and conflicts. We'll need to learn the skills of democracy, of presenting and representing a plurality of voices and perspectives, of respecting and honoring disagreement rather than feigning harmony or expecting or assuming a priori consensus. And as neutrality looks increasingly as a happy self-deception from former times, museums need to be vigilant and reflect which interests we are implicitly or explicitly supporting, resisting, or opposing. The relevance of museums is shaped amidst global concerns and conflicts over climate change and the destruction of nature, over displacement and mass migration, over wars, over international, national, and local inequality, and over paradigmatic shifts in scientific discourses. These issues are increasingly find their way into museums and impacting museums. For me, two urgent and increasingly interrelated societal issues, global issues, stand out, which the museum sector can only ignore, deny, or fail to address, with serious consequences for our own future relevance. One is the historic and present inequalities in opportunities, power, and wealth, with their intertwined and intersecting issues of class, race, and gender that mar the intercontinental, international, national, regional, and local contexts. Global as well as local differences and inequalities of power and resources seem to be absurdly growing rather than shrinking currently. Millions of people have been displaced from their homes, and the richer countries of the global north, desensitized to the suffering of others, tighten our borders ever more tightly, retain refugees in camps under atrocious conditions, and send back and allow people to drown at sea. Another 6 million have just been uprooted here in our neighborhood, and I think that is maybe creating a new way of thinking in this context. These inequalities are exacerbated even further by the corona pandemic. As of April this year, an estimated 6.2 million people across the globe have died from the COVID-19 pandemic. Other millions of people struggle to get by. The wealth of the wealthiest, meanwhile, was estimated to have doubled over these 2 years of the pandemic, while the incomes of 99% of humanity fell, and 160 million more people are forced into poverty, according to Oxfam. How do we maintain a notion of equity or equality when locally, as in my town in Copenhagen, differences in life expectancy vary by 7 years from my neighborhood, 100 meters, to the next neighborhood? How can we maintain an ideal of elective democracy when $60 million was spent in a political campaign to secure 1 seat in the US Senate? Inequality kills was a headline that gained traction in 2021. The second urgent issue is the alarming crisis in the destruction of nature and the unsustainable relationship between humans and the rest of nature. Museums need to get involved in addressing sustainability and be part of developing sustainable solutions. The anthropocentric worldview, with its underlying assumptions and principles, is no longer viable. In Europe, 2020 set yet another record as the hottest year in recorded history. The summer of 2021 was the hottest summer ever recorded. In both the south and the north of the planet, forest fires devastated huge territories of land. Yet more species are continuously lost and biodiversity further decreased. Arable land disappeared at a rate no one anticipated, and land is depleted to the extent that only an estimated 60 harvests are left. And yet, I would say that one could walk into most museums in the world and get very little sense of the gravity of these issues, and importantly, how much people are actually concerned about them. I see no route for museums to break these dissociated or disconnected trajectories and to grow our relevance that do not involve some heavy self-reflection or descending into what the artist Fred Wilson so pointedly called the dwelling of the demons in his digging into the hidden or unconscious meaning of our collections at the Museum of World Cultures in Sweden. I see no escaping the painful examination of how our scientific traditions are stained by violence and how the values of racial, gender, class, cultural supremacy have shaped the paradigms of what a museum is, shaped the collections from the ways in which they were collected, through the meta-language through which they have been classified, documented, interpreted, and narrated. If museums are to retain relevance or credibility, I see no choice for us but to systematically delegitimize these processes in our institutional histories. These burial urns were broken by the collecting scientists for easy transport from La Candelaria in Argentina to the Ethnographic Museum in Gothenburg. In Fred Wilson's interpretation, the muted and shattered objects whisper insistently to the visitors when they walk by. You don't know enough about me to forget about me. What I have seen I cannot tell. What is left of me is here, but I remain far away. A part of me wants to go back. A part of me is. I'm broken, but not finished. Museum collections are just the tips of the icebergs of colonial and imperialist dominance, but they are significant on both sides of the colonial divides as highly visible, tangible, materialized memories of a European and Western time of glory and dominance still clinging on for life in these dedicated institutions of museums when otherwise lost through the 20th century wars of liberation around the globe. As a subject matter, repatriation serves as an entrance into exploring the concepts of justice and of rights, of spiritual rights, moral rights, legal rights, and into discussion of decolonization in its broadest possible meaning. It serves as a parable for how we as professionals perceive ownership and our relationship to communities, and a compass for our resistance to loss of privilege as academics and professionals. My tenure at the National Museum of Denmark in the late 1990s was the time when the first transfer and repatriation of 35,000 objects from the National Museum of Denmark to the new National Museum of Greenland took place. This is an example of the amnesia I mentioned before, which seems to have strangely descended on this process, which was called by the then president of UNESCO to be exemplary, and maybe still is the largest, most extensive process of repatriation internationally. Following, as you will remember, French President Macron promised a couple of years ago of returning cultural property, particularly to the African continent, a self-pitying cry went through Europe at the prospect of empty shelves in European museums, which would have sounded just pathetic if one did not know how strategic and well orchestrated it was. But as these images, room after room, case after cave, shelf after shelf of Inuit treasures at the National Museum of Denmark can assure anyone, after the repatriation of 35,000 objects, there's still no empty shelves in the Inuit floors of the National Museum, except, of course, metaphorically, the empty shelves where one might have wanted or expected displays of current Greenland and the colonial conflicted aftermath, which, significantly, is not exhibited or discussed and never has been. Ignoring, denying, marginalizing, and other passive-aggressive blocking of repatriation by major Western museums pose, I think, a real threat to the credibility of museums as such, to the global legitimacy of museums as institutions, as well as to any cohesion in the global museum community. And I think it's becoming increasingly obvious that the opposition and resistance toward repatriation is rooted inside our profession, inside museums as institutions, rather than in the general population. One of the more meaningful and thought-provoking terms I've learned over recent years is that of epistemology of ignorance, referring to an epistemic non-knowing, a systematic allowing oneself to not know, to not recognize the pain and suffering of others in ways that serve to support and facilitate one's own dominance and privilege. Pain, as in inflicting open wounds and reopening badly healed scars on body and soul, is the description and image constantly used by those who have lost objects and heritage to the omnivorous museums in the global north. Subjugation and humiliation are other frequently used terms about objects absorbed or imprisoned in European museums. In museums, as in life in general, the process of decolonization has been perceived and framed almost solely as the need and responsibility of the colonized. I believe that those of us who've inherited white privilege and inherited the position of humiliator, of oppressor, of subjugator, need to let go of this inverted epistemology, as it has been called. There is no time or space for contrived innocence or ignorance in this context anymore. In the US and Canada, in the UK, and less explicitly in mainland Europe, over recent years, current and former staff and core stakeholders have taken museums to task for the continued racism and sexism, the phobias driving personal exclusion, discrimination, and exploitation internally with staff and externally with partners. Monuments, trustees, directors, curators have fallen from their pedestals. Structural changes are obviously needed at all levels to restate accountability and transparent and reciprocal relationships. But while these conflicts of discrimination and subjugations are epistemic, they will obviously always be enacted and experienced personally. Museum professionals tend to claim that we are not educated to deal with heavy emotional issues. If that is the case, we need to train. It seems impossible to develop a new global ethics if it is to be embedded in character structures shaped and marked by a sense of supremacy. And there's no absence of non-hegemonic methods out there that can be used, methods that are geared to creating spaces for dialogue where dominance is kept at bay, where listening is active and deep, where statements are not contradicted, emotions not disparaged. Personally, I believe that autobiographical objects can be tools and provide both powerful and a gracious route for museum people in exploring and articulating how personal and emotional experiences intersect with large and general societal issues, not least those around gender and ethnicity. But whatever methods we choose, we need to train ourselves in self-reflection and sensitize ourselves, learn to feel, to empathize with the reality of others, be they our close colleagues, our near communities, or distant people across the globe who have a primary relationship and claim to our collections. I know that this current situation with the war here is providing a real quick crash course for what practical empathy and solidarity means for museums for some of us. But returning to collections, to Fred Wilson's Dwelling of the Demons, my solution or my entrance to the problematic and conflicted character of museum collections is not to abandon them, to ignore or abolish them, but to insist on developing them to contain, express, and shout the pain, the anger, the despair, the hopes and fears of our current times, our protest and resistance. Over recent decades, new collecting has become extremely minimal in many museums. In some cases, new collecting has become almost solely digital documentation process. But if new collecting ceases to be a continuous and defining live stream in the whole of the museum will become static, relying on frozen history and stale narratives of times gone by, of a past no longer questioned or reinterpreted through fresh objects. The museum will not, from its own core, be compelled to reflect its live and breathing environment or communicate the meaning of life in a dynamic, contemporary sense of its constituents. And the more controversial, the more contexted a subject matter a museum wants to communicate, the more important is the richness of the objects. And if the research is deep enough, the objects will actually emerge. Even the most private, most muted or hidden aspect of life will have an object side that speaks, for me at least, more profoundly than any words. These images here are pillowcases made by a widow from her dead husband's pajamas. They were collected by the Museum of Copenhagen as part of our effort to revitalize our collection of the objects left after 19th century philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, exploring his many different interpretations of the concept of love. One understands immediately and intuitively how the widow falls asleep at night, imagining herself still cradled in her husband's arms, resting her cheek on his breathing chest or his pulsing thigh, the pillowcases subtly and softly illuminating the philosophical concept of Kierkegaard's concept of both erotic love and love beyond death. And here are some significant contemporary objects collected at the Museum of World Cultures in Gothenburg in Sweden around 2004. A key to understanding these is that they could not have been collected by the museum on its own. They're collected within new, extensive, and unusual forms of partnership and cooperation. First three objects collected on the theme of human trafficking, from the horrifying depth of the colonial divides and the shocking contradictions of globalization. A so-called patera, collected from the Spanish coast by Almeria, where it had been left after bringing refugees from Africa into Europe and added to the Ethnographic Museum's substantial collection of boats. It was collected through the personal relationships of a museum curator and in cooperation with the local customs and border authorities. escaleras de servicio, stairs made with whatever objects were at hand, sticks, t-shirts, pieces of rope and string, by people trying to scale the 3-meter-high fence topped with barbed wire around the tiny European outpost of Melilla on the northern coast of Africa to enter the European Union. The stairs were collected and brought together by the artist Fernando Claveria and then acquired by the museum. And here, for me, the most gruesome objects of all, these backpacks provided by traffickers to the Asian children whom they sent into the pedophile markets of Europe, containing a change of clothes, a mobile phone through which to receive instructions, with painkillers and a pack of condoms, their only shield against the evils awaiting them. The backpacks were seized by the Swedish police in their unraveling of a ring of traffickers and collected by the museum through our cooperation with the police on the theme of trafficking. And then here two objects that represent the absolute opposite, a hopeful and self-confident self-representation proudly blazing its way across the divides. These objects were collected by the National Museum of Kenya on behalf of the Museum of World Culture. There were about maybe 75 objects that were supplemented with thousands, literally thousands of stills and videos created by young Nairobans to portray their everyday lives in a major contemporary African metropolis. All the collected material was selected, registered, and documented by the National Museum of Kenya, bypassing the European specification, classification, and value system. These objects are self-portraits rather than outside interpretation. The power and interpretive authority remains in the area where the collecting takes place. And I've used here examples of transcending traditional ethnographic collecting, but we should not forget or deny that inequality or asymmetrical relationships of power are also constitutive for each of our local or regional and national contexts, as is the alienation and divides between museums and their constituents on lines of class, ethnicity, and not least education, and distributed neatly as demographic patterns across the national and urban topography. Objects and collections are, by definition, documented, labeled, and interpreted from the privileged frame of reference and points of view of the time and context of their collecting. People who fail to conform to the dominant conventional norms or who have resisted or confronted power and public institutions have had little place in museum collections. Museums are known to be trusted and respected institutions, but they are, on closer scrutiny, also clearly the normative domain of the white, straight, well-educated upper and middle classes. Socio-political movements, alternative lifestyles, subcultures have been largely excluded. Challenged and queried, potentially also strengthened by community quests for access and participation, and by communities seeking empowerment and agency, museums begin to renegotiate our relationship with the world around us and explore alternative formats and methods that meet the increasing diverse surroundings and the growing expectation for access and equal participation. This works best or works only when part of a long-term and continuous process of relationship building. Some few museums, for instance, managed to reach across this disconnect and collect from the Occupy movement a few years ago. Other museums realized that the authenticity of their solidarity is, and not unfairly, questioned when they try to connect with the unrepresented, underrepresented, or misrepresented communities, as, for instance, recent or non-legal immigrant communities. Donating the hopeful, joyful, or shameful objects of one's complex daily life is an act of trust, which the museum does not a priori deserve, but will have to earn. The images here are from a fashion show at the Museum of Copenhagen, when these wonderful silken garments by a local designer were shown by a group of Copenhagen transvestites in connection with our LGBT exhibition As I Am back in 2009. It was a historic and it was a rather ecstatic event. but it was also in essence an ephemeral experience. And it was museologically a missed opportunity as we failed to collect any of these garments or any of the garments worn by the models in their everyday lives where they peopled the museum's neighborhood. And I would imagine that the event is now completely gone, even from the institutional memory of the museum itself. And let this sense of the ephemeral, the fleeting, the transient and transitory bring me from the theme of inequality to the second urgent issue I started out with today, that is addressing the destruction of nature and developing strategies towards sustainability, which also tends to defy a number of the basic cornerstones of the traditional museum concept. Under the theme of urban nature in 2014, the Museum of Copenhagen created a thematic exhibition through all indoor galleries and transformed all our outside areas from forbidden grounds into fertile gardens, used as productive spaces for children with special needs, a place to be proud of, a place in which to grow, a place for people running in to dart in and pick their dinner. There was a wealth of traditional objects in the exhibition galleries, but in this context, I'm more interested in the living objects, the elusive, transient, and fluid objects and boundaries of the garden of nature. And these coming images here are from the International Garden Festival in Chaumont-sur-Loire, a castle dating back to the 15th century, a UNESCO heritage site, counting royalty as well as sugar magnates in its pedigree, transfigured over the last decade into 32 hectares of park grounds and land art, and an incredible wealth of cutting-edge contemporary art exhibitions interweaving with the original interiors and furnishings of the castle, staterooms, stables, kitchens, attics, outbuildings, and each summer hosting 30 new themed gardens. Chaumont-sur-Loire is by far the most satisfying visitor and meaningful visitor experience I've had for decades, reaching seamlessly across disciplines, categories, types of knowledge, ways of showing, unifying gracefully and seemingly effortlessly, a soaring critique, and yet also a celebration of our relationship with and part of nature. In 2019, the theme for the temporary gardens was Gardens of Paradise. In 2020, a return to Mother Earth. In 21, biomimicry. And here in 22, it will be Ideal Garden. Can we revise our interpretation of nature, animals, plants, and what we've been taught to think of as inanimate objects? Can we give nature status of subject rather than object? Can we comprehend the implications as different worldviews collide and as different systems of thoughts merge and create new moral and new judicial constructs, as in the legal personhood granted by the Wanganui River in New Zealand, and the constitutional rights acknowledging Pachamama in the Ecuadorian Constitution. Sustainability is not another new or better layer of artificial fertilizer or new penicillin in the production of pork. It's a basic shift of paradigms about nurturing, feeding, and replenishing rather than deplenishing. It's about never extracting more than one contributes and returns. Can we start thinking with, learning from nature, learn the many different languages of nature, valorize them, maybe initially as parables and metaphors, and then perhaps by and by as mythologies and systems of thought? In the polyphony of voices of nature, can we learn to see ourselves as humans, as one of them, as part of nature? Can we learn resilience and a mass of concurrent strategies for sustainable survival as those of plants? Can we let go of the notion of status, solidity, and stability, of permanence in structures and shape, which have all been so fundamental in the museum concept? Can we let go of the ideal of forever? Can we find our way to something we cannot yet imagine in terms of what is collectible, what it means to preserve, and in how a museum institution, a museum space is composed? Can we inch our way towards what's be called an ethics of belonging in nature? For museums, I think this is once again returning to what it means in organic terms to be rooted and embedded in one's communities as strands in a network of relationships depending on and nourishing these bonds for one's life and sustenance. Deliberately, I did not, as I often would, choose today an example from museums where indigenous communities and curators have shaped more holistic and transcendent epistemologies and developed alternative approaches or models and methods rooted in this non-oppositional, non-binary relationship between humans and nature. I chose instead this example, this ancient castle, as weighed down as can be with the powers of European history and traditional Western framework, to show that such radical rethinking, radical regeneration, and radical shade-shifting, such metamorphosis can happen, and with enchanting results when tapping into and finding the potential in each of our institutions, particular settings, our resources, and our strengths. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jette. As you said that we are rusted, we're a little bit rusty with public events, but your paper was really packed, and my rustiness here appears with kind of this typical reaction that after so much information, I would rather prefer to go and sit there and think on my own a little bit. So I'm not pushing at the discussion, but I'm sure that people would like to reflect or have the opportunity to ask things as we are here. So please, do you have questions after this fascinating talk? I will also stand a little bit here further. Yes? Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you, Jette. It was very interesting and made me think, and I think a lot of other listeners as well, about the exhibitions that we create and how we actually view things today and how we thought perhaps think about those things differently. When you said about perhaps giving the exhibits and the objects back to the nations and to the people from where they were taken hundreds of years ago or some time ago, I was thinking about an exhibition that we were kind of planning, and it's an exhibition of the Baltic German landowners that have brought different objects to Estonia when they had huge estates here. And would those objects be classified as also something that we should actually not be very proud of and show here, and perhaps even think of giving those back to the nations where they come from?
I think a lot of this is contextual, and that there is no sort of single abstract answer to this. I think the obvious discussion is this one between the global north and the global south, because it follows resources and exploitation in general. I think it's interesting that, as I say, the amnesia around the huge repatriation and very, very good process from Denmark to Greenland is not talked about. The quest by Iceland for additional returns of the manuscripts has not abated. You know, the Danes like to think that that is all done and over with. It's not. It keeps re-emerging. And I think, you know, I mean, you know that Denmark is a country about this size, if you look at it in the map. But interestingly, objects from up here are displayed at the National Museum over here, so it becomes a testament to the nation's glory. It becomes, it illustrates the glory of the nation. It doesn't really talk as much about how was it that these people in the very, very northern tip of Denmark, which is now considered the sticks of the provinces, why were they in such intense exchange and trade with people in the south of the Balkan? You know, so in museums this is what I mean by representing power. You know, what the interpretations we give are confined within a particular worldview. And I think that's what always needs to be analyzed and constructed and deconstructed and looked at once again when you see this group of objects sit very strangely within our collection in general. You know, how did it come to be here? So I don't think there's anyone. I think these processes are long and intense and community-based. And looking at, I recently looked very closely at the Icelandic returns of these manuscripts, and it was deadly interesting because every big, you know, it's like a drama or, you know, a big series. The richest man in the country was the one who paid for the High Court case against the repatriation. It was actually students who marched in the street opposing it. It was weird. And I think we all have really interesting cases like that to look at. Yeah.
I can see the microphone has moved over there.
Thank you. My name is Pille Pruulmann-Vengerfeldt. I want to thank you first for a very intriguing and thought-provoking presentation. And there are many questions to ask and many directions to go with it. But I was just first wondering, you brought a wonderful example from Kenya, where you talked about collecting every day and collecting the street life of Kenya, but also mentioned in passing that it was not systematized according to the European collection systems. And I was just very intrigued about and wondering whether the European standards, Western standards, what do they exclude or what do they ignore when we systematize our collections following what people would appreciate as in standardized manners in many ways? So I was just wondering whether you have some concrete examples that you can give to elaborate on this one. Thank you.
I think the interesting entrance into this process was actually, to follow it from the start. We did quite a lot of what you'd call audience research at the Museum of World Cultures. And we had some really interesting response, and these, Swedish people are quite sophisticated, so they would say, I know, they said in these surveys or, groups, focus groups, whatever we had, I know that people on the African continent live in these big megatropolises, but what I see is the savannah. My inner images is the bush, it's the savannah. Please give me counter images. So we knew we wanted to work with some of these big urban environments. And an example, I think, could be many museums would have lots and lots of Maasai objects in their collections. Lots of ethnographic museums would have these Maasai objects, which would be, in our context, registered in a rural, traditional concept. But lots of Maasai actually live in cities, for instance. And so this city focus we had, and the fact that these particularly young people brought the vibrancy of city life, city-urban life, to these collections. And, you can look at these collections and a T-shirt like that, what is it? The car door, very, very significant. They wanted a whole car, which unfortunately we didn't get. We got just the door. And if you pressed me, I wouldn't be able to say exactly how does a registration guide at the National Museum of Kenya differ from the registration guide at the Museum of World Cultures. You know, I don't know that in detail, but I know that the approach brought to it and the fact that these are everyday objects and the mix of categories, the non-divisions were different. The sense of it was different. And in the exhibition where we showed them, these were all shown with their documentation context. So the whole, what you'd call the card, you know, if you'd call that, was displayed with them, so that this sense of the power that is embedded in categorization was there to be seen. Is that a bit of an answer? Thanks.
Can I see any more hands? There is one hand with a microphone already.
I can ask to come
Yes.
back to easier topics. I just wanted to ask, in listening to you, which was really refreshing after so many years of not being part of physical conferences. I just wanted to ask a very light question. What do you do and what do you say to people who don't agree with you at all? Like an easy question.
That was a simple question.
See, I have never minded disagreement. I don't actually mind disagreement. I mind power and displays of power. It was, this is then, you asked it as a light question, so I'll give also a light answer. Living for 6 years in Sweden as a Dane was not easy, because much as we consider ourselves people of the North, in Sweden we are considered sort of temperamental and impulsive, and for me, agreement is not an a priori. I think I said this also. Agreement is not something you can assume, and consensus is not something you can assume. Consensus is something, if you read consensus, it's through a process of back and forth and voicing your agreements and disagreements and shifting your positions and accommodating the other. For me, conflict or disagreement is not taboo. I actually, I think very, very basically, for me, that is what democracy is about. If we didn't want to voice disagreement, we wouldn't need this process. Then we would just all, it would all be the same. And I don't really believe in sameness. I don't think sameness is what categorizes us, and I don't see sameness as an ideal either. I actually quite like differences.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to extend? Are there any other hand? Yes, I can see one more hand.
Hello, I'm Ilse Salnaja-Värv and representing the Estonian Rural Museums. And one thing or thought which I always have when I hear about the colonialization of the world and the blame of the white race, I'm feeling that here in the Baltic states and in Eastern Europe in general, the situation is kind of a bit different, because yes, we are born white, but we had always been more on the other side. We had always been the slaves, not the ones which comes with the white power. And then often have this feeling that we are blamed for something just because we are born in here. But we have nothing to do with the topic. And the other comment is about the green part of the story. As the rural museums, we have to represent the ecosystems and all this human within it. And I think sometimes we struggle in Estonia and in Baltic states in general with the need to sell so to say, to the people, the museum, which speaks about agriculture, because people in here are still very close to the nature. And often I think we don't really need to prove it. Everyone knows it.
To the first part, I usually make a distinction between being responsible and being accountable, if we use those words in English, because, obviously, being born in the 20th century, I'm not responsible for Denmark being a big slave trading nation or having had colonies in, the West Indies. But I think I am to be held accountable for the privileged position that I inherit as a Dane. Copenhagen as a wealthy city became wealthy also through the slave trade. Denmark as a nation became wealthy also through exploitation of the colonies. So the privilege that I have are not unconnected to that story that I was not responsible for. Do you see what I mean? That accountability, I think, is a different thing from saying, obviously you're not responsible for something that happened hundreds of years ago. But I certainly, as a Dane, and I know the situation in Europe, obviously, will have its own, global north and global south, and its west and its east. And, as I was saying, in my tiny country, there's a lot of, we have a lot of discussions and a lot of conflicts between, center periphery could be one way of conceptualizing it, which was used a lot a couple of decades ago. If you look at my country, you obviously have a capital that is huge relative to the country as a small country, and the population of the capital is gigantic. And of course, you look at this capital and you realize it's made for a nation that was that much bigger in a country that is now this big. So these rural-urban conflicts are certainly there. I think part of what I was trying to say, referring to that urban nature exhibition at the Museum of Copenhagen, I think the interesting thing is to begin to look at the urban environment also as an ecosystem. So some of the knowledge that you have in the rural area and some of the organic ways of thinking that are still thriving and active in the rural environment, some of that consciousness have to be brought into the urban environment, which has for centuries been run on a different, on a different philosophy, which was a philosophy of splitting and dividing. And so I think that's probably, yeah.
Yes, it's a complicated question because there were two statements which kind of, I would have my own answer, but I as a moderator, I'm not going to do it. But I think what interestingly came out certainly was that we here in this zone, especially during the past months, feel very much like as Eastern Europeans, in the political sense. But I would take the advantage of bringing it more back to the museums and actually following what Kerttu already asked, like taking a chance of speaking more about collections. I have actually several colleagues here in the audience, and I think also in the offices maybe, who are studying and who are working with Finno-Ugric nations and groups and their cultures, which are now in Russia. And as a kind of this long tradition, we have one of the biggest museum collections, Finno-Ugric museums collections, as you might know, along with Helsingi, St. Petersburg and Budapest, Hungary. And I have been thinking about it a lot, that we are right now in a different situation, maybe. Like you mentioned the context, like each of these collections are in different contexts. But one of the things which has been a line here or thread starting from your talk is this colonialism issues. And that's true that not studying it myself, I have kind of as a side observer seen that the theories or approaches of colonialism, including the museology, not really do fit here. But I would still appreciate like your take on that, because we are in between. My colleagues who are studying it are currently studying the 20th century also field work and the ways as part of history of ethnology, how these collections were inquired. And reading their work, I can see quite a lot of these methods which were brutally acquiring some objects to collect them, and these methods are all the same. But at the same time, we find ourselves in the situation which I just bluntly call Russian colonialism, and this is manifesting especially now. It was part of the agenda when these things were collecting, but now if someone asks like whether we should return them, my understanding is also that this is kind of out of question in this time and moment, like in a way it is a security depository against this colonialism. So we are both acting in a colonial way when acquiring these, but we are subject to another, so these layers coming together here. And your experience, not from Europe but also elsewhere, like I'm not asking for advice, but kind of how you look into the situation, or what kind of insights. I'm sure that my colleagues here, there would be a really interesting roundtable on that, like looking at these different sides. And they might have their own answers, but in their articles, they answer to my statement kind of indirectly through studying particular situations and field notes and descriptions of the objects and so on. So this colonialism is here, but not in a exactly similar way, like the Eastern European conditions. How do you see it? It was a long comment now, but please, I was thinking aloud.
I think one of the phrases I used here was decolonization in its widest possible sense of the word. And in that sense, it becomes a bit of a metaphor. And I know people who work in the real, South-North, they don't like to use that word in a metaphor. But I think when we're talking in the way I talked here, it is using the concept as you could use it talking about gender, or you could use it in any deconstruction of power or analysis of what constituted the power and display of power, and how were the objects part of that display of power. I was, trying to think of Eastern Europe. I was sent by the Council of Europe to Kosovo right at the end of the war, because they were looking at reconstruction of heritage and stuff. And I was taken around a lot of museums where the museum director would point to empty shelves and say, these objects are in Belgrade. Mm-hmm. These objects are not here. See, obviously that's not colonialism in the way you'd use that term, but it has been display of power, and it's been objects removed and taken. That's why I was using the example of my tiny country, where taking things from one area to another shifts the symbolic meaning and what it is, the power it's supposed to support. I don't, advice or how to. I think I would tend to think more and more locally. That, if you look at the wonderful Gunnerstrup cauldron, those of you who are archaeologists will know that Gunnerstrup cauldron, which comes in reality from down the Balkan area. Why should it be in Copenhagen? It has, no business being in Copenhagen, actually. But it has a business being where it was found or where it was made. But the Copenhagen position is a national monument position. So local, I think, is interesting. And I think consent which is a concept that becomes more and more used, certainly in sexual politics. Consent has become a really important concept. Maybe we also should think about consent in museum terms, because maybe you would like to keep, this is certainly the case, in some countries say, no, we keep this because it also marks the relationship, the current relationship that we have between our countries. So it becomes more an exchange on an equal footing than it becomes appropriation. And I think these, again, are contextual. I mean, we have Norway asking for returns of objects from Denmark, and I think Denmark has a couple of objects they would like. So history changes, and somehow we have thought that museum collections are static and should remain static. And I think that's one of the, with all these nature parables, that stasis, I think, is one of our core issues. And one of the places where we become, what can you say in English, clumsy. We're not nimble-footed enough always to be able to address what's important for people out there, because we are caught in some very, very static, very frozen concepts at times.
Mm-hmm. Yes, in the case of Finnugric collections, on the one hand they are frozen, and on the other hand they are the kind of in the middle of the turmoil, like they might be disconnected from their source communities for unknown time. Otherwise, well, digitally maybe not, but so of course my question goes beyond our ability to solve it here. But thank you very much for the insights. I'm checking if there are more questions in the hall. Can I see some hands? No. Everyone is thinking about there. I will check the time. Actually, I'm also very touched by this second part of a story about the nature and. Are you moving with a microphone to ask the question? No. Okay. The part of nature and kind of museums as sources or agents of communication. And I have found myself reading all these European documents actually, and how they position themselves, that heritage institutions, both other heritage sites but also museums, are kind of described as a subject to those kind of the institutions who have to fill the sustainable development goals or who have to reform themselves. And this is kind of technicistic, is that the word, kind of technical approach. And at the same time, I think that there is a lot of potential in heritage to be part of the communication. But I think the balance is like us being passive here. So have you any recommendations or ideas how to turn it around? Your presentation was one example of that, how museums simply do it through their program. But in terms of this debate in cultural politics, the way I have read it is more like, can we make old buildings more sustainable? Not that they are part of the sustainability, or that our collections are sources of future kind of development. So how to turn it around and be these active messengers and actors more efficiently? Because we are doing it. Your example was really impressive.
For me, it's really key that you work from the particulars of your collection, your situation, your demographics, your topographics. I think these ideals and these values, which I think, this foundation of values, I think is really important. But I think the way you work for them best is when you make your things, your exhibitions, your research from exactly your place. I mean, one of the other really great exhibitions at this time was the Fondation Cartier in Paris, which is a fancy, exclusive contemporary art museum in the middle of Paris. It couldn't get any fancier. But they did an exhibition called, wonderfully, We Are the Trees. We the Trees, it was called. And their point of departure for doing this was they actually sit on a little bit of land. If you think about it, you hadn't noticed that before because you saw the impressive building, but they actually sit on a bit of land where there were a number of trees. So they started their research with their trees in this urban environment, and it grew into this incredibly fabulous exhibition on trees, which brought contemporary artworks, a lot of really, really nice Latin American stuff, and really, really great. I didn't show anything here from it, but you start with your own. You start where you are, and you don't think, this exhibition done in da-da-da is exactly what we're going to do. In Copenhagen, we had a front plaza from the Museum of Copenhagen, and it was exactly, you can imagine it, a gravel driveway, and then there was a piece of lawn with the signs of do not walk on the grass. Everything was forbidden, and you're not allowed to park, you're not allowed to do anything. And the back, there was a piece of grass that was never used. So we created a big garden in front, which was the one you saw images of, which was a very urban garden and all edibles. And literally I've seen people run in and pick stuff because, they were running late for dinner at home. So it became a place of growth, and for these children who worked it was very much a place of growth. The back became this almost wild place, completely different from this structured one. But we started with what we had and saw what was the potential in that, rather than implanting some abstract concept of sustainability. We have the sustainability goals, we'll do. Because, you want the richness of you as a museum. You're not writing a book, you're not writing an article. It's the museum that you want to speak from. And you do that by digging into your own collections, land, building.
Yeah. Thank you, yes. Essentially what we are also trying to do here, we have built with it and these anecdotal situations where we have very sustainable surroundings, but some of the visitors still discuss that they don't have roses because they ran out of money. So these are the local contexts. But
you can have them give you roses.
Exactly. So last chance to ask a question. No, I think that people save your energy for the upcoming week. Thank you once more very much.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, and I will, for announcing the next speaker, I will move over here. Here is still, okay, I can see still an old presentation here, but this first session has also another speaker, and we are going to talk about a very nearby country, Latvia. And our next speaker, Raivis Simansons, is co-founder of a think tank called Creative Museum. He has a background in museology from Leicester University, and currently one of your works, what you are going to talk about now, is related to Žanis Lipke Memorial, and you're working on development of its new civic education center, right? And this is the case study. I'm not reading the title. I'll give the floor to you, please. Yes, absolutely.
Pille, thank you for invitation and for introduction. So Agnes, thank you for taking all the practicalities on you. So this invitation to present at conference organized by the 2018 Kenneth Hudson Prize winning Estonian National Museum which would explore the museum relevance in the context of EMEA, the European Museum of the Year Award scheme, came already 2 years ago, as we know. So I'm very glad we can finally gather for this much needed exchange against all the odds. In this presentation, I will first contextualize the 2014 Kenneth Hudson Prize winning Žanis Lipke Memorial in Riga within the tradition of European Museum Forum. And secondly, I will look at it within the national and larger European memory landscape. This way I try to arrive at an estimation of relevance or influence, to reference Hudson in terms of its public quality. So the Hudson Prize. The notion Museum of Influence, goes back to the founder of European Museum Forum, British journalist and museum enthusiast Kenneth Hudson. His best-selling book, Museums of Influence, appeared in 1987 and famously caused controversy in the sector regarding who should be included in such a normative selection. In the recently published Revisiting Museums of Influence, 4 Decades of Innovation and Public Quality in European Museums by the European Museum Forum, who runs the EMEA under the auspices of the Council of Europe. The editorial board has reflected upon Hudson's legacy and made a new selection of Museums of Influence. This time round, the selection was not meant to be normative in any sense, as in the original version, as it turned out, but rather illustrating some of the innovative practice and public quality in the tradition of EMF. Assessing the initially proposed 200 museums, the editors of the book first applied criteria such as type and geographical location of the museum, so as to cover the 47 member states of the Council of Europe. Now the number is down to 46 due to banning of Russia because of its aggression in Ukraine. Additionally, the editorial board made sure that proposals came from judges representing different generations. However, the key criteria was that working in, visiting, and assessing museums, these were the ones that authors wished to write about themselves. So this makes away any pressure from selection as any kind of a normative list. So at the Lipke Memorial, we were obviously surprised and honored to learn that our small organization is among the 51 included in the list. Being aware of the purpose of publication and understanding that we talk about the loose selection, we still found it an extremely stimulating exercise to do an analysis of our relevance or impact against the backdrop of EMF philosophy, which informed this selection. So we asked ourselves, what was the reason for being selected apart from typological and regional criteria? So indeed, in 2014, the Lipke Memorial was awarded Kenneth Hudson Award, a special prize created in 2010 as part of the EMEA scheme to carry forward the spirit of Hudson's work by recognizing a person, project, group of people who have demonstrated the most unusual, daring, perhaps controversial achievement which challenges the common perception of the role of museum in society. But how exactly did Žanis Lipke Memorial challenge these perceptions? So firstly, this memorial museum dedicated to Žanis Lipke, Latvia's most famous rescuer of people during the Second World War, was a private initiative, built entirely through private donations by a team, none of which was a museum expert. As I will show later, its innovative and visionary approach nevertheless overtook the national narrative of memory, politics, and history by almost a decade. According to the author of scenario of the memorial, Jette Sandahl, it should be viewed as a work of art, as a metaphor, and a pure idea. The EMEA judge who assessed the newly opened museum back in 2014 wrote an essay about Žanis Lipke Memorial in the new book and said, "It would have been a novel, but it is a museum." Now, it brings us to the second factor of challenging perceptions, which is creativity, or rather, pointedly said, imagination. So borrowing from another outstanding example indeed, where the formula of Lipke Memorial can be summed up as a powerful confluence of remembrance, and imagination. And this, the latter was said about the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam, which serves throughout my presentation as a recurring reference when we talk about truly globally impactful communication of the difficult past by a relatively small museum. So the Žanis Lipke Memorial is still a very young organization. In its 10th year in operation, it is just getting started with blending remembrance and imagination in order to reach broader international audiences. Keeping in mind these 2 points of departure, the visionary private initiative to commemorate an act of civil resistance in Nazi-occupied Latvia, and imagination. In doing that, I will look at the larger picture of museum development in the Hudson system, if you like to term it so. So the Hudson's Museum of Influence appeared in mid-80s, a decade when the advance of neoliberal economics compelled the public sector to modernize. And because museums are seen primarily as public service in the UK, the pressure for accountability was on as soon as Ms. Thatcher was sworn into office in 1978. The traditionally ambivalent attitude in UK towards funding culture, with a traditionally strong orientation towards the capitalist US rather than social economic Europe, necessitated a remarkable change in museums. Following the British example, public quality and innovation became the mantra of museums in the last 2 decades of the 20th century, and it goes on. Hudson's, the inventor of industrial archaeology himself, gave a brilliant analysis of the typology of museums against a broad historical background. Having named the types of museums in chronological order of the development, antiquarian and archaeologist, temple of art, nature and environment, science, technologies and production, national and local history, he then arrives at the newcomer to the family, and that is a history in its place of action museum. So these are archaeological sites in the broadest sense, houses, battlefields, or a woodshed in a house yard, like in case of Žanis Lipke Memorial, or by extension a former military airfield, as in the case of our host today. So in situ parameter is crucial here. So this type of museum is often located in proximity to the site of some dramatic historic event. And Hudson mentions museums like Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial Museum, or again the Anne Frank House, as outstanding examples in this type of a museum. However, his ultimate museum of influence in this category was the Vasa Museum in Stockholm, the 17th century Royal Swedish ship that was being salvaged with a complete set of objects on board. As one of Scandinavia's most visited museums, Vasa demonstrates the popularity of the phenomenon termed since the mid-90s as the dark tourism, which is also present in the regions which are largely spared from the horrors of the 20th century totalitarianisms. Similarly, Anne Frank House in Amsterdam and other Holocaust memorials further east are increasingly popular among both locals and tourists, provided that they not only mark the sites where the past dramatic event happened, but that they program the work. So program public work is what makes the difference at the museum in general, but especially at the memorial site. So this aspect of museum work prompted the public quality of museum work prompted Hudson to liaise with the Council of Europe to initiate the award scheme. On a deeper philosophical level, he was undoubtedly motivated by the value system of the civilized world agreed after the Second World War, with its somewhat idealistic vision of European communities, European Union later, as its materialization of the new vision in the continent. As a member of Second World War generation himself, Hudson knew exactly what was at stake. But as a down-to-earth realist, he didn't necessarily position museums as problem solvers or agents of change, as later generations of museologists, which he liked to mock actually, would do. But he clearly saw museums as a means to the end, not just repositories of stuff. His dictum that museums have one major dilemma to deal with, which is how to make visitor more self-aware and self-confident, became the reference for generations of judges and correspondents of European Museum Forum who continued his work. So the program is the key, and the name is in the program. And now I will look down and focus on the Baltics. So a quick look the European scale and then Baltics. A quick look at the nominees of Kenneth Hudson Award helps us to understand what exactly is invested in the prize named after him. In 2010, for example, it's the Museum of Contraception and Abortion in Vienna. Then it's Museum of Broken Relationships in Zagreb, Lipke Memorial. Then it's International Red Cross and Red Crescent Museum. It's the Museum of First President of Russia, Boris Yeltsin. It's the National Museum of Estonia. In short, museums that serve a platform for discussing sensitive and at times controversial issues. Museums that do not hide behind the bushes when it comes to taking a stand in human rights issues. In fact, museums which are essentially a product of the post-war human rights regime, which is time and again challenged. So the value system that informs the decision-making of the jury appears as just as important as the excellency, the technical excellency of museums. Now, taking a closer look at the new list of museums included in the selection, dealing with the difficult past, we can distinguish between, for example, war museums like in Flanders Fields, Belgium, Tampere in 1980 Museum of Finnish Civil War, the War Childhood Museum in Sarajevo, museums of catastrophes like the Vasa Museum and Mary Rose Museum, museums of political history such as the German Emigration Center in Bremenhaven and the European Solidarity Center in Gdansk, cemeteries and museums reflecting upon the end of human relations like the Glasnevin Cemetery Museum in Dublin, and the Museum of Broken Relationships in Glasgow. And finally, two so-called memorial museums, Žanis Lipke and the Caribbean Center of Expressions of Memory of Slave Trade and Slavery in French Caribbean. Now, from the bird's eye perspective, one cannot help to notice a pattern. So practically all European collective or shared remembered topics are present. According to Klaus Legewi's 7 circles of European memory, these themes can be depicted graphically like this, like ever expanding circles with the Holocaust as the symbolic and negative founding myth of the post-war Europe at its center. This is followed by Gulag and Soviet communism, expulsions and ethnic cleansing after the war, wars and crises as engines of European development, colonial crimes, history of migration, and finally, European integration after 1945. What I'm pointing at is the fact that European collective memory landscape today isn't complete without all of these 7 circles, with the majority of them being dark chapters of history. And all of these topics are indeed present in the selection because there is an influential museum, or indeed a museum of influence, for each of them. What is striking, though, is that Žanis Lipke Memorial appears to be the only museum among the 50 dealing specifically with the Holocaust, and even not being termed so by its founders. So the question of Holocaust, nevertheless, lies squarely in the middle of Europe's historical debate. So working through the history of Holocaust in the post-communist bloc countries is said to be an entry ticket to the European Union and the West in general, as bluntly put by the British historian Tony Judd. So a few thoughts about this entry ticket. Unlike in other 2 Baltic countries, the role of National Memory Research Center, which would be charged with the task of writing recent history, has been played not by an institution, by a commission in Latvia. So a commission of historians of Latvia by the President's office. The mission of this project was, and I'm quoting the press secretary, largely to confront Russia's attempts to use history to tarnish Latvia's image in the West, as Moscow sought to slow down Latvia's accession to the NATO and the EU by trying to portray Latvians as an active participants in the Holocaust and even as seeking to rehabilitate Nazism, a theme that might sound familiar in the audience in view to how Ukraine is portrayed by the Kremlin propaganda now. In total, 29 volumes of the 20th century history have been published. The project ended this year with a closing volume entitled The Impossible Resistance, Latvia Between 2 Totalitarian Regimes, 1940-1991. So after a thorough research of 3 consecutive occupations, the research and public history incentives finally arrived at the resistance. civic and armed, as a positive and consolidating factor in recent history. And I argued that the Lipke Memorial has played an important role in anticipating this turn through uniquely combining the story of a Holocaust and civic resistance. Volume 18, published around the time of joining EU and NATO, which also coincided with the end of the second term in office of the President of Republic Vaira Viite Freiberga, who during her 8 years in office had encouraged its voluminous research work on 20th century. The Commission concluded that the Holocaust now should become part of historical consciousness, not so much through academic research, but primarily via popular books, monuments, plays, memorials, and in many other ways that make up our shared memory. So back then the plans were in place to build memorial for the rescuers of Jews at the place of the former Riga Choral Synagogue. And I quote, "Memorials are for visiting, but they often stand lonely or get visits only occasionally as a tribute to memory or even politics, and not as a cognitive memory or moral necessity." Here we see that washing up for the next public occasion. So another 15 years later, we can now assess where we stand in terms of public history, and especially in the memory of the Holocaust in my country. Apart from Commission's academic work and the monument to the rescuers of Jews that was opened by the outgoing Vaira Viite Freiberga in 2007, there has been no other purposeful institutionalization of memory of Holocaust by the state. The initiative, drive, and imagination had to be sought elsewhere and produced grassroots. The Žanis Lipke Memorial stands out as perhaps the most distinctive embodiment of the wish of the Commission back in 2006 for the rescuer legacy to become part of our collective or shared memory through a creative response, a response that was badly needed for the national interest in memory, history, politics in order to confront the Kremlin's accusations, and for the civic education. Obviously, the time didn't stand still. Already in the 90s, in most of the Baltic states, new museums of the post-communism regime, the recent history museums were established, being themselves as a side effect of a larger transitional justice process in the region. Their titles were meant to denounce a crime, so resembling a courtroom situation, Museum of Occupation in Latvia, Museums of Occupations in plural in Tallinn, and a Museum of Genocide Victims in Vilnius, were bearing the brunt of the history, memory, politic fights. That returning to the time that didn't stand still, new generations came, and new generations of museologists, historians, and the public at large started to question the exclusively ex negativo shaped national narrative. So the referencing to the Danish Freedom Museum in Copenhagen, dedicated to the national resistance, and also referencing the first president of Estonia, Lennart Meri, for whom the Museum of Occupations, which opened in 2003, was a freedom's house. The focus eventually shifted to resistance in the Baltic too. So it is only in the last few years that, after long public debates, as in the case in Tallinn, and the pressure from academic circles, as in Vilnius, that these museums have changed their respective titles to Museum of Occupations and Freedom, Vabamu, as in Tallinn, and Museum of Occupations and Freedom Fights in Vilnius accordingly. So a compromise has been found. There you see, in brackets, until 2018, the Museum of Genocide Victims. So it marks a major shift. Such debate is present in Riga as well, though it has not convinced Museum of Occupation, in singular, to change its title to dates, signaling a presence of a more conservative and perhaps real political assessment of the situation in the region. Does the narrative of resistance, armed and civic, which projects the vision of nation as an active subject, not a passive object of history, even if it is showcased through heroes like Žanis Lipke, or armed resistance after the war, or individual dissidents till the collapse of Soviet Union, has not yet been institutionalized through changing the name of one of its central museums. The vector, however, of history and memory politics in Baltics is unmistakable. And this niche of popular history of resistance, and in broader terms freedom, I argue, has been filled in Latvia by the Žanis Lipke Memorial in anticipation of this turn. Since the founding of the NGO, which worked on the establishing of the Memorial Museum, the national memory politics has been only catching up with this private initiative. So after unveiling of commemorative plaque at the Lipke family house in 2014, and then by opening of the monument, again by Vaira-Viiti Freiberga, it is in 2012 opened Žanis Lipke Memorial, which played the function of telling the story of resistance. So in our case, resistance as a civic disobedience. And it's now 2022, and it's only this year that the resistance movement in Latvia has been institutionalized at the state level through establishing a Memorial Day of National Resistance Movement, which is 17th of March, and that is in connection to a memorandum issued by a Latvian Central Committee, still under the Nazis, but demanding restoration of independent state. And additionally to that, another Remembrance Day of the armed resistance of the national partisans on the 2nd March, which commemorates the final armed fight of the joint Latvian-Lithuanian partisan group against the Soviet occupants in March 1949. So the numbers are telling, with 30,000 partisans in the Lithuania's forest, 12 in Latvia and around 10 in Estonia. Armed resistance in post-Baltic countries accounts for 50,000 men and women who were actively sabotaging the regime and ready to die for their cause. With the current situation in the region, the relevance of historical knowledge and the memory of resistance is back on the agenda. So is the need for a conceptualization being discussed as of lately. It has been acknowledged that in the final volume of Commission of Historians, dedicated to collaboration and resistance, and I quote, "The study of collaboration as well as resistance in Latvia has not involved major discourse on the concepts themselves, and the attempt at conceptualization has not been consistent enough." Well, in other words, in an instance of practice, imagery, preceding theory, concepts, academic writing of history of national resistance in Latvia has been catching up the storytelling of a museum. Now, in this city of semantics, perhaps it is worth mentioning that in his late days, the inventor, the father of the conceptual history, or in German, Begriffsgeschichte, Reinhard Koselleck, who published his voluminous encyclopedia of concepts of geschichtliche Grundbegriffe, the concepts of political change in Europe, in his late days turned to studying visual means and visuality, indicating the change in Europe's journey to modernity, which was till now shaped by the concepts, while now being shaped more by the imagery. Starting with the seminal political events of the 1980s, concepts have been replaced now by the transformative power of imagery. So, case in point is the completely inflated concept of Nazism and fascism. What is denazification in Ukraine at the minute? Question mark. So, ascendancy of the interest and accordingly relevance of the stories of resistance through a silent everyday heroism told by Žanis Lipke has been lately proved on a completely new level. Silent Hero Memorial Center in Berlin tells the story of people who stood by persecuted Jews in Germany and German-occupied Europe under the National Socialism. It is in its latest expansion phase from 2020, it has now installed a permanent exhibition on the rescue of Jews all over German-occupied Europe. One of these stories features Žanis Lipke, which was made in cooperation with the museum. So a blue-colored dog worker from Riga has now come center stage, as you can see on this landing page of the Silent Heroes Memorial. The center itself grew from a small university project, has become now a federally funded research institute in 2000s, one of its kind in Europe. After decades-long and meticulous work, working through the horrors of the state totalitarian regimes, they say that interest now is growing in life stories of ordinary people who helped Jews suffering persecution during the Nazi dictatorship. And it is not least due to popular history products such as Schindler's List that the interest in the subject has been heightened. So the template of the so-called Vergangenheitsbewältigung, or in English, getting terms with the past, in which the Germans are world champions, as put by the British historian Timothy Garton-Ash, is applied if applied in a politically honest way, assumes critical self-examination of both collaboration and resistance. This German patented template of regret against the backdrop of which civil rescuers and armed resistance fighters shine like a star, conflicts with the template of the victimhood, more popular in Eastern Europe countries. The so-called Holocaust genocide template had found entry in Eastern Europe through the victim's perspective of the occupied countries. Legitimate as it is in transitional justice situation, it has an inherent danger of being used as a way to externalize culpability, it is claimed in academic writing. The change of title of these two institutions showed before in Tallinn and Vilnius is a case in point. The change indicates a shift in interpretation of recent history in the Baltic states regarding themselves as double victims of World War II. Now a few words about the power of imagination and creativity. Museum of influence, or one that is at least trying to live up to its expectations. Lipke Memorial has tried from its start to rely on cooperation with creative personalities in shaping its form and content. The signature building of the memorial by architect Zaiga Gaile not only got numerous awards locally and internationally, but 2019 has also been listed as a cultural monument of national importance. And it is alongside the National Library, a few miles away. And these two are the only 21st century public buildings which are listed in the country. But when it comes to a museum, it goes beyond architecture, and especially in the case of a memorial museum, which is a contradiction in terms. Therefore, most of the time, the creativity is achieved through cooperation with creative individuals. Memorial as such is listed and stays intact. It is through the interpretation through which the creativity and new visionary approach can be achieved. And to the existing logotype of the Žanis Lipke Memorial, which has become already a brand, there is a hope to add a new logotype, which is on the screen. You can see it from the bird's eye perspective. So in the museum's 10th anniversary this year, which is this year, it marks the new vision for the development of organization. The process of information communication of difficult past by putting more effort into educational work is at the heart of this vision. Work is in the progress on the blueprint of the House of Courage, the new educational center of the Žanis Lipke Memorial. So on this logotype you see on Latvian Drosmismāja, which is Latvian for the House of Courage. So as the Anne Frank House Our role model demonstrates that Memorial Museum deals not only with the past as such, but it is tapping also into the actual events of today, while maintaining core mission of safeguarding memory of the person and of the family. It can also be truly contemporary history museum and academic civic education center with a program that especially young people can relate to. Given that the story of Žanis Lipke is already included in the national school curricula, we believe that House of Courage can become a partner for teachers in the learning process. For that, new premises are needed, and if you've seen the previous images of the memorial, which is a small, secluded space, this is just the opposite. It's open, it's bright, it's spacious, it has more square meters where you can do the educational work and co-working. Now, in line with the patriotic education of the country and the situation in the Eastern Europe, a special national defense training scheme is being introduced to Latvian schools. So by 2024, it's in 2 years, national defense training will become a mandatory in the general school curriculum. It will be administered by the Latvian Cadet Force under the Ministry of Defense, and it will train accredited instructors. Becoming part of national defense training system may be one of the ways forward for the House of Courage. Like it or not, we are in this situation. The experience of world-renowned leaders in civic education, again, such as Anne Frankhouse, shows that the bottom-up approach in developing civic education programming can take decades to become mainstream. It is thereby unlikely that the memorial and its House of Courage will ever become financially sustainable. Such a business model simply doesn't exist in the Baltic regions today. However, the planning and programming of the new educational center foresees a number of ways of revenue generation, including museum shop and cafe and premises rental. Additionally, staff and consultants are working, exploring the ways how the planned services such as co-working and a makerspace could work to promote creativity and simultaneously be monetized. So, and the final slide, in terms of urban planning, the House of Courage will eventually become an integral part of the Mile of Knowledge, which comprises Latvian National Library, several university campuses, business centers, and residential areas. We have commissioned this work during the fundraising campaign, and it convinced us that we can take this calculated risk in developing a new wing for the museum. So to conclude, it remains to be seen if the formula built by private money, funded by a public purse, will work this time round. Both parties will need to strike a new deal, preferably if the construction is at least partially funded by the public money, so as to increase the public stakeholders' share in the new civic education center. If there's a cultural institution in Latvia which has proved the efficacy of public-private partnership over the last decade, it is the Žanis Lipke Memorial. The memorial has anticipated the turn from victimhood to resistance and, metaphorically speaking, freedom in national memory politics, and on its own accord has paved the way for making a story of an individual courage as a basis for education for the young generation. As such, it has a potential to live up to its potential as a museum of influence, indeed, and that is making its visitors more self-aware and self-conscious, as per Hudson's definition. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As I'm the timekeeper as well, we are reaching quickly the lunch break, so we have no long time for discussion, but I hope we can take it over to the lunch break. But I have one short question, obviously a little bit journalistic, given the times that your talk, very rich talk, packed with a lot of ideas. It was about these sites and the difficult past, but as we all notice, our difficult past has suddenly become difficult present. Like, do you think it has been a very short time when the crisis is so acute, but does it somehow change, or has it recontextualized its particular these development plans, not the immediate reactions and education and so on, but the kind of the new site, the development of the new site, as the past is now a present?
Mm. To be honest, no, in no way, because it has been hardwired in the very concept of this place from the very start. Mm-hmm. It had to be just a shell where you talk about what is happening here and now. And that is through that visionary creativity, which is achieved through artist in residence who comes and interprets, or through a public debate, or whatever form it might take. It's virtual reality, for instance, that we are working now. So no, we knew what we wanted from the very start, and it just has accumulated this urge for doing this way.
So it is an example of time-proofing your project, I would say, because times are so much changing. So thank you once more. I know that there are people who are. There is a question still. All right, fine. I try to push it into the lunch break, but she's literally working in the area. So please, Kirsti, please ask a question.
Yeah, thank you, and I'm apologizing keeping you away from the lunch. So.
No, this is essential dialogue. So
no, I just have a question of understanding, and then a small comment. Thank you for your paper. It was really, really rich. I really hope I can reread it at some point. As Pille told, I'm Kirsti Jääsala from the University of Tartu, and we currently have a project dealing with Baltic history museums, led by Professor Ene Kõrasaar. So just the question of understanding is about, you mentioned that Žanis Lipke Memorial is an example of private-public cooperations. And the question will be about how it goes. Are you funded by the state, partly? And do you also collaborate with other grassroots movements in memorializing Holocaust? As I know that at least before COVID, there were also another initiatives to memorize the Rambola massacre. And the comment is about Vabaõhumuuseum in Estonia and Museum of Occupations and Freedom Rights in Vilnius. I think the name changes are coming from the different backgrounds. I mean, that for Vilnius case, it came from outside, let's put it so. And for the Vabaõhu, it was the initiative of the museum itself. And also that, as in Estonian case, we really have a new conception and a new exhibition than actually in the Museum of Occupations and Freedom Rights, we still have the same way of looking at the past as it was before. Thank you.
Right. The first part of the question, financing. As soon as it was built, the deal was made with the Culture Ministry that the budget for the staff, which is fairly small for full-time jobs, is covered then by the ministry. Then is the municipality funding, and of course the project funding, which we go through every year. The cooperation. Our major partner ever has been the Jewish community of Riga, who has provided content for this museum in the first place, the rescue stories. This work continues. There will be more of those stories. There's 134 cases of the righteous among the nations, but the cases amount to 500. So eventually this place will become a museum which works with the Jewish community to cover all the Latvia in terms of saving Jewish population. Indeed, yes, the Rambola massacre is commemorated every year, again, by the Jewish community. But then again, our initiative has been a commemorative day at the National Monument, introduced as of lately, 5 years ago. And the last part of the question was it was just a comment. Yes, but as I said, one was the public debate, practically a referendum as a poll and so on in the Italian case, and in Lithuania it was a more academic debate indeed, yes.
All right, it is when museum people come together, we have so many ideas to share that I have to be this gatekeeper and say thank you with a small gift. Thanks once more. And now it is, I think, already time for lunch break, right? And Agnes, can you add something? As our cafeteria is officially closed, we are serving you some food. Do you give any more hints?
You just go out and you will find something in there.
Okay, we will see.
Not a complicated task.
Yes, and we will be back 1:45, right? In 50 minutes. I believe it's sufficient.
1 hour.